G'day, everyone. Welcome to the State of the Industry for February 2026. I'm excited to share with you what's going on nationally, and we're going to take a look at what's happening here locally in the Yakima Valley. So before we get started, I need to give you our notices. One, please, please, please do not violate the TCPA, the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. It is the do not call list. We do not violate that. We follow all the guidelines and the rules, and we call in a TCPA compliant and very friendly manner. Additionally, all commissions are negotiable. We won't be talking about that today, but we just need to know that. And we also need to understand that we will not violate fair housing or the CAN-SPAM Act. And remember that whenever you're using AI, it has a tendency to be inaccurate from time to time. So please do understand that. Now, with that being said, I want to take a look at what's going on at the national level. There are three key metrics that the government and the Fed are looking at in order to assess the health of the economy. The first one is unemployment. And what you see here is that the goal that the government has and the Fed has is to keep unemployment under 6%. Under 6% is a pretty healthy market, and we can continue to grow. You can see that other than during COVID, we've been under 6% since 2014. So literally for the last 12 years. So that's been a good thing. And if we look at what's happening on a monthly basis, in December, we came in at 4.4% unemployment, and the January numbers came out at 4.3. So there's been a slight improvement. And basically at this level, you can see that for most of 22, we came in the high threes or mid threes, which basically means that everybody who wants a job had a job. So we're starting to see that soften a little bit. And again, the Fed's going to have to decide how they want to approach this if we see those numbers start to climb back up again. Now, the second key metric that the Fed looks at is GDP, gross domestic product. And the goal is to have GDP growth of around 2% per quarter. Now, 2% per quarter is considered strong and healthy growth. Anything negative is obviously not a good thing. And oh, by the way, by definition, 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth is what the federal government has termed a recession. You can see we had a recession at the beginning of 2020, the first 2 quarters, and that was because of COVID. We also show that we had 2 negative quarters back in 2022, but the government at the time said, well, that's not really a recession. Well, guess what? It really is, because you said it is. Now, you can see the first quarter of 25, we had that negative. And again, the 2025 numbers are a little bit, well, how do I term this? It's hard to say, are they really accurate? And the reason for that is there's a lot going on. The negative growth in the first quarter was a result of retailers and importers getting ahead of the tariff announcements and importing a lot more product than they normally would. And then, of course, the next 2 quarters, they have to unload all of that product. And consequently, the way they measure GDP is imports versus exports. So we yet to see what the Q4 numbers are to see where they come in. And so the jury's still out in terms of what we think that the GDP numbers are going to be for 2026. Now, the third one is inflation, right? And this one's had a lot of focus over the last few years. But the goal is to have inflation of around 2%. That's manageable. Now, by the way, when inflation runs out of control, and you can see we had that happen as a result of COVID, right? It jumped literally to 5.1%. You know, the challenge with that is 7.1%. Inflation actually is a huge threat against any democratic society, because when inflation runs rampant like that, the populace gets uneasy. And it's why governments get voted out, by the way, when inflation's high. So the goal, and the Fed's goal, is to keep inflation down around that 2%. It's why they raised the interest rates, short-term interest rates, really dramatically. In fact, over 5% in the space of 12 months. And by the way, it had the desired effect. You could see it cooled the inflation rather dramatically initially. And then inflation's been somewhat stubborn. And it has stayed above that 2%. We ended December, right, with CPI at 2.7%, and core CPI, which is basically the consumer price index with energy and fuel stripped from it, came in at 2.6%. The number came in lower than expected at 2.4% in January. Numbers just came out. So again, that is also part of the reason why the Federal Reserve is holding pat on rates when they met in January. So we'll see what happens come May. Now, this one to me is a little bit troubling because this portends that we have to have something different happen. What you see here, the red line on this graph is federal government expenditure. So it's government spending. The blue line is tax receipt, or the taxes that, or the revenue that the government brings in. Now, as you look at this graph, what you notice is that as a country, we're spending more than we're bringing in. Now, my first question to you would be, if this looked like your income and expenses for your own personal household, how sustainable is that? And I think we could all agree that that's not really sustainable. In fact, it's not for our country either. At some point, somebody is going to have to figure out how they correct this. Now, in order to correct it, it can be done in only two ways, right? They could either lower expenditure or they could increase taxes or revenue. Chances are it's probably going to be a combination of both, but at some point we have to pay the piper. So we're going to see that happens. And when that does happen, it's likely to have an impact on our economy and how people spend and how they think and how they feel about the economy. Now, that's the government. What's happening at the local, at the household level? And what you see here is the blue line represents mortgage debt, right? This is household mortgage debt. And right now we have over about 13.5 trillion. And even though that's a record, I'm not overly concerned about that number. And the reason is because it's secured by record levels of equity. And so our real estate has gone up in value, as have our mortgages. But guess what? We have more equity than we have debt on those mortgages. Now, the one that is more concerning to me is this sort of magenta line here, and that is non-mortgage debt. And you can see there we have over 5 trillion. Now, that line is made up of primarily of these four categories. The number one debt we're carrying that's not mortgage debt is actually auto loans. And you can see we have over 1.6 trillion in auto loans. Now, of course, the challenge with that is cars tend to be depreciating assets, if they're assets at all, more of a liability. And it's because of those high interest rates, along with the high purchase price of vehicles, that we're seeing this debt is as high as it is. Now, the second biggest debt is student loan debt. You can see 1.65 trillion. Now, if you look at this graph here, what you'll notice is that the vast majority of that debt has actually been accumulated over the last 12 to 15 years. Now, if you take into consideration the average age of those people carrying that debt, it puts them in their mid-20s to 40 years old. It's also one of the reasons why I believe that last year we had a record high average age for first-time home buyers, which came in at 40 years old. And I believe it's because of that student debt that we're carrying. Now, the magenta line here represents credit card debt, and you can see we're at 1.23 trillion. The thing that is concerning to me here is this trajectory. You can see it has the steepest gain. And I think that our federal government is doing a wonderful job. Actually, they're not. I'm being facetious, but they're behaving the way a lot of people are. And what I mean by that is they're outspending what they're making, and it's showing up here in this accumulation of credit card debt. And then all other non-household debt, you can see, has been relatively flat. Now, this is of concern, right? And again, I'm not here to bum you out. What I'm here to do is share with you what's going on and reality so that you can actually trim your sails to take advantage of the market we're in. And what this represents is the percent of loans that are 90 days plus delinquent. And you can see here the dark blue at the top is credit card debt. It has the highest delinquency rate, somewhere between 12 and 13%, right? So people are not paying their credit cards, allowing them to go 90 days plus, which again, last time we saw that level of delinquency was back in the Great Recession, 2008 to 2010. Now, you'll notice there the gray line is all other debt. Again, it's up, but it's fairly flat somewhat. The red line is student loan debt. And again, what you see here, a dramatic increase because the government said, okay, now you have to start paying your student loans again. And what I would argue is that a lot of people have were living their best life after COVID and outspending their income and consequently not making their student loan debt and paying that. You can see, however, that their auto loans, they're fairly good, only about 5% are delinquent, which means people are paying for their cars. And you can see, even though people are not paying their credit cards or their student loans, they are making their mortgage payments and their HELOC payments. So, if we do see things change, chances are we're not going to see a massive REO market in our near future anyway. Now, the flip side of this debt that we're carrying is our savings rate. And you can see here that our personal savings as a percentage of disposable income is down near historic lows. And these numbers that you see on the screen are quarterly. They're reported quarterly. We graph them quarterly. However, the US Bureau of Economic Analysis actually publishes these numbers monthly. And the most recent number was November, and that came in at only 3.9%. Now, I want to point out that the last time we saw savings rates this low was again during the Great Recession, around '08. And by the way, this graph has been tracking the savings rate all the way back to 1947. So basically just after the Second World War. And we are in historic levels of that. Now, why does that matter to us as realtors? Well, because we need our buyers to save down payment. And if they're not saving that money, that's a challenge. Now, if we look at this shows the number of home sales annually going back to 1990. Now, you'll notice that there are 6 columns colored pink here. And the reason that they're colored pink is that they're basically the same trajectory. So what we had happen in the '06, '07, '08 looks very similar to 2021, 2022, 2023. In fact, went from 6.5 down to 4.1 and went from 6.1 down to 4.1. Now, if you look over the last 2 years, we have been basically flat. And in fact, I would argue that the real estate industry has been in recession for the last 3 years. Now, the good news is that even though the industry's been in recession, the economy has not been in recession. Unlike back in '08, right, where we saw not only did the real estate industry go in recession, but the entire economy did. Now, what's fascinating when you look at '08, it actually took 4 years before we saw the housing market come back. Well, guess what? We're 3 years into it. Chances are we're going to probably see a similar year. In fact, we're projecting at Keller Williams that we should see about 4.3 million homes sold in 2026. Fingers crossed. Now, and what you see here is home sales monthly, and you can see they've been very flat. In fact, I just saw the January numbers, and they came in at 3.95 million on an annualized number, which is down from last year. In fact, housing sales in January of 2026 were down 8% from 2025. So again, right now is looking like we're going to have a continued flat year unless something significant would happen that would cause housing sales to jump dramatically. Now, this graph here I really like because what it shows is the opportunity that real estate is. And what this graph really says is it's always a great time to buy the right real estate. Now, the green line you see on here is what we call the trend line, and it represents the average annual appreciation in residential real estate that has occurred historically in this country. And by the way, that rate is 4%. Now, you can see all through the '90s, the market was following that trend line. It wasn't until 2001 where we bumped above it. And by the time we hit 2006, we were actually 21% above the trend line. Now, it could be argued that real estate was overpriced in 2006. And arguably it was. Why? Because demand outstripped supply. And in fact, it was because of the subprime lending debacle that anybody who could fog a mirror could get a loan and everybody became an investor. Now, then, of course, we had the Great Recession and we saw values drop precipitously down to a low in 2011. And then it started to appreciate again. And actually, it was following that trend line until we got to 2021, where all of a sudden from 2020 to 2021, we had a dramatic appreciation in the market, again, supply and demand based. And oh, by the way, we ended last year at just 9% above where we should be based on this trend of 4% appreciation per year. Now, how many of you wished you'd actually bought more houses in 2006 that you still own? See, I would argue that even though you overpaid, perhaps, if you hung on to that property, even only till 2015, you still got all your money back. But what's that 2006 purchase worth in today's dollars? It's worth more. Now, one of the challenges, of course, is a lot of us had people who buyers who said, you know what, the rates have gone back up. I want to wait until they come back down to 3%. Or, you know what, I think we're going to see prices come down and I'm going to sit it out. I'm going to wait. The challenge with that type of thinking is those people have missed all of this appreciation. So again, what this says is it's always a great time to get in to the right piece of real estate and then hang on to it. Now, you can see here that there's seasonality to the monthly median sales price. You can see we ended December at 405,000 was the median price. Inventory, of course, has been a big challenge for us in industry. And we've had a shortage of inventory for an extended period of time. Now, we basically said that a 6-month supply of inventory would be what we would consider a balanced market. I would argue that that's more of a band rather than a hard line. To me, it's 5 to 7 months of inventory would be considered a balanced market. Anything less than 5 months is the seller's market. Anything more than 7 months is absolutely a buyer's market. And by that definition, you can see that we've basically been in a seller's market since 2012. Now, one of the reasons that we've had this market with low inventory is because during the Great Recession, we saw a lot of builders go out of business or dramatically reduce the amount of inventory that they were going to build. And consequently, depending on which economist you listen to, we have a deficit of housing in the vicinity of 3,000 to 5,000 homes, single family homes. Now, ideally, the builders would just go and build more product that could make up for that shortfall. However, they're not doing that. And consequently, we've seen this continued low levels of inventory, right? And you can see here on a monthly basis, we're still down there in seller market territory. And again, to the point here, new construction, ideally, they should be building 1 million homes a year in order to house our population. And in order to make up for that shortfall, they need to be building way more than that. And you can see that for the most part, they're not. In fact, they're not even building 1 million a year. Now, certainly not through 2025. Now, mortgage rates. And again, the good news is that we've moved far enough away from 2020, 2021, when we saw interest rates drop down sub 3 for mortgage rates. So there's less conversation happening now about, oh, I can't wait for it to get back to 3. Guys, if you look at this historically, going all the way back to 1971, the average interest rate over that period of time would be 7.81%. Now, if we only measured back to 1990, the average interest rate would be basically 6%. So right now, we are probably in what would be a new normal, right? We're in that range of averages. And by the way, if you look back to 1981, where interest rates jumped dramatically and went to 18.63%, we still sold homes in 1981. And we had to be creative. There's no doubt about that. And it wasn't easy. It's not easy. But the reality is that you can still make a great living regardless of what the interest rates are doing. So where we are today, right, is we're bouncing around. You can see over the last couple of years, the rates have been relatively flat, jumping in that 6 to 7% range. And we know certainly that once you get down to that 6 range, more people certainly can afford to qualify to buy a home, and that should help us. So ideally, but I mean, if you think about this, the idea of going back to 3% is probably not going to happen in our lifetime. And in order for interest rates to drop that low, what would have to happen? Well, something bad, right? Like a major recession would do that, or a pandemic. But be careful what you wish for, okay? Now, I just came out with a report on what they consider to be the top 10 hotspots in 2026. And these are the markets that they did. And for a variety of reasons, each one of these markets has different reasonings behind it. But number one is when the cost of housing and incomes, the gap gets dramatic, then it becomes more difficult for people to afford housing. It's when that gap closes that actually becomes more affordable housing. I would tell you, close to us, Spokane is one of those markets where incomes have risen enough and house prices have stayed relatively stable that gap has closed. And I believe that's one of the reasons why they've identified Spokane as one of the top 10 hot markets for 2026. But all of these other markets, particularly on the East Coast, all have different reasons for that. Now, why does this matter? Well, the thing is that demand and activity will improve, but not everywhere the same, right? So the recovery will be concentrated in markets where housing and incomes, as I said, are coming closer together. And ideally, we have the opportunity to target a new pool of rate qualified buyers. And I'll show you what the impact will be here in Yakima. If we see rates go from that 7% down to 6%, how many more people can actually afford to buy a home and what that could actually do for the number of home sales in this market. Additionally, pricing strategies matter more than ever. And what we know is that homes are still selling at a relatively brisk rate if they're priced right. Now, we also know that we see over the last 12 months, we've seen more listings expire. We've seen more price reductions than we have in a long time. Why? Well, I believe it's because we've got sellers who feel like they're holding the golden ticket and they want to cash it in. So they want to price it, still expecting that appreciation that we've been talking about for the previous 5 years. Now, by the way, the reason that they're out there on the market at that price is because as an industry, we haven't known how to have a conversation with them about the realities of the market. Now, I believe that we've had at least 12 months of that type of market, and we're starting to see it change. So when we see price reductions in the market, it's not because values are going down, it's because sellers are finally learning that they cannot overprice their property if they want to sell it. So having a correct pricing strategy really matters. Additionally, inventory mix is becoming a competitive advantage. If you look at your market, what you're going to see is there are different price ranges that are selling at a faster rate than others. So making sure that you've got a competitive mix of priced inventory will be a competitive advantage in this market we're going into. Additionally, understanding migration patterns. Where are people moving from to Yakima? And I'm going to show you that here in a minute. But understanding what those migration patterns are so that you can go out and build relationship with realtors in the markets that people are moving from. See, that realtor-realtor referral opportunity is massive. And there's an opportunity because there are people moving into the Yakima market. Now, let's take a look at our local statistics here in Yakima. And I want to share this number because I think this is important. And if you look at what's happened here in Yakima County in 2025, this is the number of transactions per agent and the percentage of the agents who did it. Approximately 560 agents in YAR last year, and this count is as of November. And of those 560, 165, or basically 30%, did zero transaction. Now, 175 brokers did between 1 and 4 transactions. So basically another 30%. So if you've done 4 deals or less, you are in the 60% of the agents in the marketplace. Now, I would argue that 1 to 4 deals a year is not a career worth having. And, oh, by the way, there's no reason why you can't do more. And the reason I say that is because the deals are there. The transactions are there. In fact, if you closed 10 transactions or more, you were in basically the top 25% of all realtors in Yakima Valley. So the opportunity is immense. Now, I'm fond of saying real estate is an equal opportunity industry. It's just unequal reward, right? We all have the same opportunity, but we don't all make the same amount of money. Why is that? Well, I would argue it's because we don't all do the right things, right? And everything we do in real estate doesn't have the same impact to our income. So it's focusing on the 20% that really matters, right? What are those items? What are those things that I need to be doing in order to make sure that I'm closing enough transactions so that I can meet my income goals and I can serve my family? Let's do this. So let's look at what's actually happening here. So this is median list, under contract, and sold prices over the last 2 years of single family housing here in Yakima. Now, what you'll notice is that the median list price last month was up about 10% from January of last year. In fact, the median list price was $410,000. Now, the median under contract price dropped by about $8,000. So it was $376,000. And the median sold price dropped from 367,500 down to 342,500. So that's a 25% drop. Now, I would a $25,000 drop. I would argue that that is not because the market is going down in value, but because we're actually selling more inventory at a lower price. And I think that that will show itself out. Now, if we look at supply and demand, and again, what you see here, one is first, let's notice that we have seasonality, right? Our market is a spring summer market and things slow down in the winter. Now, if you look at that, our inventory of single family houses in Yakima, we had 679 active listings in January, and that was up 17% from January of last year. Now, our under contracts, we had 122 properties go under contract last month, and that was up 3.4% from January of last year. And then in terms of closings, we had 90 homes close in January, which was down 13.5% from January of 2025. Now, I think what's significant about this, I look at these numbers and I say, well, okay, the for sale and the under contract numbers are actually what I would call windshield numbers. And what I mean by that is it's like looking out of the windshield of your car, looking forward, that's what we see. And it tells us what's coming towards us, right? It's predictive of what our business is going to look like in the future. Sold numbers, on the other hand, are a rear view mirror number. So what they tell me is what's in the rear view mirror, what's already happened. Oh, if you look at that, we had 90 houses close in January. Now you understand that each one of those sales represents two transaction sides. There's a buy side and a sell side. So that's 180 transaction sides. My question for you is this: how many do you need in order to be on track to hit your goals? Because whatever number you tell me, they're there. It's just about you getting your unfair share of that market. Now, if we look at months supply of inventory, right, you can see that we went from 3.5 months in January of last year to 4 months of inventory this year. Now, I would argue that that is still a seller's market, albeit closer to a balanced market. And it's why, by the way, that both our sellers feel like they have control and the buyers feel like they have control in the negotiation. And again, as realtors, part of the value of what we bring to the table, right, is our ability to help those sides negotiate. And one of the ways we do that is by educating them about the realities of the market that they're currently in. Now, days on market, we saw improvement actually. It went from 96 as an average days on market back in January of 2025 to actually 78 days on market this year. So that's an improvement. But again, what this means is we have to have conversations with both our sellers and our buyers about the realities of the market. So if 78 days is the average days on market, what that means is half of them sold quicker than that, the other half took longer. So if I'm working with a buyer and I show them a property that's been on the market for 80 days, it doesn't mean that there's necessarily something wrong with that property. It just means it's average days on market. That's all. Now, I wanted to share this, and this is one of the benefits of being a member of NAR. And they do a lot of statistical analysis, and they do that for the 100 largest metro areas in the country, of which Yakima actually falls in that. Yakima County has about 260,000 residents. So you can actually go into NAR at nar.realtor and look at their metro market statistics. And I'm going to give you a quick view of this, as well as the QR code so that you can go directly to it. And it's free to all realtors. So it gives you a housing affordability. Now, this index here, the Housing Affordability Index, basically a value of 100 means a median income family can afford a median priced house under current mortgage rates and with a 20% down. And values below 100 indicate that the typical family doesn't earn enough income to afford the median priced house. So you can see here in Yakima, we've got our median income and the median price. We're at a index of 97.7, which means it's difficult for the median income earner to purchase the median priced house. I mentioned that Spokane was deemed as one of the ones that are the hot markets. That market, the Housing Affordability Index comes in at 104.7. So over that 100 mark, which makes it much more affordable. Now, you can see here the share of income that homeowners and renters are using, or rather what they spend on housing. And, 30% or higher is considered burdensome. So ideally, you want to be under 30% of your income to cover your housing costs. You can see here in Yakima, 76% of homeowners are spending less than 30% of their income on housing. Compare that to renters, where you can see 47% of renters are spending less than 30%. And in fact, a lot more renters are actually what I would call housing poor because they're spending more of their income on their housing. And you can see there also the share of households and renters who can actually afford to purchase the median priced house. And that's by age group as well. Now, these housing statistics for Yakima going back to 2018, and you can see here what's happened to pricing, which is the green line on the graph. It went up and went up somewhat dramatically in 21, and then it's sort of leveled out in 25, 26. We see the number of home sales, which went up, and then has actually been flat to a little bit down. And in fact, it's actually crossed over the inventory. So now, for the first time in a long time, we actually have more inventory than we've had sales. So again, that's going to impact how we talk with our clients, both sellers and buyers in this market. And here it shows the home equity gains by the number of years that people have held their house, going from 2025 back 10 years. And then you can see also new construction, housing starts. They have indeed increased, but not necessarily to a level where we've got a ton of inventory. Mortgage applications, again, so there was 6,700 loan applications made in Yakima County. 53% were originations for loans. 20% were denied, by the way. So 1 in 5 were denied. And look at the average interest rate over that last 12 months, and that was 7%. You can see the distribution. The vast majority of these loans, almost 70%, were conventional, 20% FHA, 7% VA. And then you can see the interest rate that those applications were at, vast majority at 6 to 7.5%. And then you can see by age and whether they were used for home improvements or refinancing. And of course, at that sort of interest rate, the refinancing was probably debt consolidation, not because they were looking to get a better rate. Here you see the general economic conditions, right? The number of employees has grown since 2016. And then, by the way, the wages have improved as well, although only 0.5% wage growth. And that's why we're seeing that affordability be a problem. Additionally, you see in Yakima County, unemployment rates running at 5.4%, which is a full percentage point above where the national rate is and where the state rate is. The impact of lower rates. So what you see here is the number of households and the number of renters who can afford to buy the median priced home at a 7% mortgage rate. And you can see there all households, 24,000, of which 3.5 renters. If the rate were to drop a percentage point from 7% to 6%, what you notice here is an increase in the number of households who can afford to buy. And in fact, if they fell from 7 to 6, there'd be 3,900 more households that would be able to afford to buy the median home, which includes that 1,000 renters. And while 10% of those households typically will buy, that would be another 393 transactions. So again, are you having conversations out there with your sphere of influence and in the marketplace, educating people about the impact of what happens when rates fall. Additional demographic information about the market here. By the way, I mentioned earlier about movement, and you can see here that people who've migrated into Yakima, 67.8 have moved from within the state of Washington. So are you building relationships with agents in the Seattle, Tacoma area? Are you building relationships with agents in the Spokane market or Tri-Cities, right? So that you can get those agent-to-agent referrals. And then here you can see years built, the median property and financing, and then of course, home ownership demographics. They're all available here. I wanted to make this available to you because a lot of people don't realize that NAR makes this available to all of its members. You need to log into the NAR website, but if you click on this QR code, this will take you to this Metro Markets dashboard. And this one is a report on the housing hotspots for 2026. Guys, I hope this information was helpful. We do this every month here at Keller Williams. Feel free to come by. If you've got any questions about any of this data, do not hesitate to reach out to us. Have an awesome day and make it a really great 2026. Thank you. Take care now. Bye-bye.